since World War I, the subways are used as collective shelters. The idea of using the subways as shelters had been practiced in Paris and London during World War I. It is resumed in 1947 in Madrid. More interestingly, well, tragically for the Spanish population, the Spanish War becomes a laboratory for all sorts of techniques, including massive bombing, like in the case of Guernica. And observers from all of Europe arrive in Madrid or Barcelona to study these conditions. Here we see a page of the Architects, I think it's the Architects Journal, yes, in London, and a very remarkable article by F.S. Francis Skinner on the effects of bombing in Barcelona. Skinner is an interesting person. He was one of the founding members of the architectural office Tecton, working with Bertolt Lubetkin. I will mention them again later. So he was active in one of the most progressive firms operating in London, and observed what was happening in Barcelona in order to draw lessons for the incoming war. Skinner was a lefty. He was a member of the British Communist Party. And he and other leftist scientists, such as J.B. Bernal or Haldane, created a committee to push for the construction of underground shelters in London against the official policy. At that time, the official British policy, led by the Conservatives, was to create individual shelters, but not collective shelters. Individual shelters such as these. These are pages from a book published by an engineer called Glover, G-L-O-V-E-R, in various editions beginning in 1937, showing various ways of protecting your family by digging a shelter under your garden. Glover also mentioned possible collective shelters, and here you see a system of tubes on the top, concrete tubes under open spaces, and you see the other one is a garage under a public square in an anonymous British city. So there was a discussion on collective shelters, but basically Winston Churchill, who was leading this this civilian defense committee, was against collective shelters for political reasons. Putting hundreds or thousands of working class families under the ground and under the bombs would possibly generate manifestations, demonstrations, revolts, maybe even a revolution. And so the idea of collective shelter was radically excluded by the British public leaders. Here we see another view which is interesting, showing a network of shelters, but it was clearly an unofficial project. It was the initiative of an engineer who wanted to become famous, or at least to get some jobs. Here we find other developments. Small shelters were built before the war. This is a page of a British magazine, also the Architects Journal, in September 1939. So this one is very small. It's a shelter for an individual building. It is more on the line of what we had seen before in l'Architecture d'aujourd'hui. It's more on this side. The remarkable episode, and I think it's one of the most interesting episodes in 20th century architectural history, is what took place. I've lost my. Okay, it's what took place in 1939-40 in London. Here we see what happened. Bertolt Lubetkin and Tecton worked on an amazing underground helicoidal shelter for thousands of people, building upon their experience, I would say, of buildings such as the famous Penguin Pool at the London Zoo of 1935, where they had used the spiral ramps for penguins. So replacing penguins with humans and digging under the ground they designed this very large shelter. Again, the largest one was for 7,600 people, 7,600 people. And where is my pointer? Oh yeah. And this is not part of the project, but just a London facade to contextualize it. And you see that this project is going down with almost 6 floors and would allow the sheltered population to survive for days during a possible German bombing. The work of Lubetkin and Tecton was not what I would say done without a real commission. The commission came from the London borough of Finsbury, a borough run by the Labour Party, where they had already built a remarkable health center in the late 30s. And they did an integral survey of the borough. You see here the survey of basements and open spaces. So all the places that you could either reinforce or under which you could dig new shelters. They also worked on the networks, on the existing networks, the tunnels, the telephone galleries, the underground railways. So you see that suddenly the war produces, through the work of people observing the city closely like Lubetkin and Tecton, the war generates a new type of observation which is based on the idea that the invisible city, the existing invisible city, can be made useful during the war years. Here we see a caricature of a system on the left by Gordon Cullen, a remarkable architectural illustrator who took part to illustrated the book propagating the ideas of Lubetkin and Tecton. And on the right, you see this model photo showing you galleries where you could, into which you could take some cars. The technical details of the project were extremely refined, thanks to the work of a remarkable Danish-born architect, young at that time, called Ove Arup. Arup, as you probably know, has given birth to one of the largest engineering firms today and was the engineer for Piano and Rogers Pompidou Center. Here you see the working plans by Arup for one of these huge shelters, which was meant, of course, to be built from the ground down. It was meant to be built from the ground down, floor by floor. And Arup designed all the stages of the construction process. Lubetkin went on television. Television was fairly new at that time to discuss the project. Here we have one of my favorite views relative to the project is Lubetkin showing the project and explaining it on television on the BBC. And here you see activists walking in the streets of London and parading with a model of a shelter. But the pressure of the Conservatives was extremely strong, and the borough of Finsbury was forced to stop every experimentation. Lubetkin almost never recovered, stopped building and spent the war in his farm raising pigs and feeding his friends, the progressive architects of London, who would visit him from time to time to get good food. However, and the official policy of the British government became totally centered on individual shelters. I don't want to show them today. The Anderson shelters, for instance, were like little corrugated steel dog niches, dog houses that were built everywhere in England and proved sometimes rather inefficient. When the Germans started bombing London seriously, during the Blitz of 1941, during the Blitz of 40 and later when they continued, finally the underground was put into action. And we see here the underground transformed in a shelter on the left, photographed on the right, a sketch by Henry Moore, the sculptor Henry Moore, who documented these extraordinary conditions of life. And new types of shelters were then finally put into action. Here we see one photograph of these shelters another one here showing us how the subway stations could be equipped. New collective shelters were built in parallel to railway station to house the population, and over the ground, bunker-like entrance buildings were erected. Some of them are still surviving in London today. So in London, once again, the futuristic projects of Tecton remain unbuilt, yet the experience of hundreds of thousands of people was the experience of living under the ground. Same thing in Moscow, where the Moscow subway, which was built, the first line of which was built in 1935, it was not only extravagant in terms of architectural decorum, but it was also completely articulated with the incoming war. The first network had been planned and was very close to the surface. The network finally implemented was very deep with vertiginous stairs leading to stations that functioned like shelters during the war. Here we see probably the most beautiful station of the Moscow subway, the station Mayakovskaya on the left as it is today, and on the right as it functioned during the war, photographed by an American photographer. In the US, of course, and I'll mention some American projects from now on. In the US, of course, war remained a fiction. Not a single shot, or very few, were shot by the Germans on the east and the Japanese on the west. They didn't go further than Pearl Harbor, 4,000 kilometers away from California. Yet projects were developed. And one of them is this project I've found in the pages of the architectural, I think it's the Architectural Forum, by Hugh Ferris. Hugh Ferris, as you probably know, was not an architect, but an architectural delineator working for all the great firms in New York. And imagine using the landscape around New York, and in particular the Palisades of New Jersey, to create gigantic shelters where not only, as you see here, the population, but also possibly fighters were inserted. There were other projects in the US. I found but I have not the image here. In looking at the Deutsches Museum in Munich at the files for the constructions of the V1 and V2 sites, I saw press clippings showing an American Gibraltar, i.e. a fortified underground facility in San Francisco, which had been press clipping about it had been collected by the Germans doing the projects we've seen before. So there were other projects. But now I want to shift to the question of visibility, or rather invisibility, and to the question of camouflage. So we've seen one particular strategy, burying people in order to avoid the losses due to bombing, people and machine with factories. Here, the issue is different. It is preventing bombing by, in a way, deflecting the bombs, by disturbing the perception of the air crew during the bombings. And this is called camouflage. Camouflage is not new to World War II. It was invented during World War I. But at that time, the camouflage in World War I was the business of painters. The Brigade des Camoufleurs, section de camouflage, sorry, in the French army was essentially made of painters, and the same is true of the German and English camouflage battalions. World War II was about using architects and landscape designers and working at a different scale, not to camouflage objects seen on the ground, but camouflage objects seen from the sky. And everybody wanted to take part into that. Fernand Léger applied to get a job for the French army, failed. Then he applied for a job in the US army, failed. Salvador Dali pretended he had some solutions, and it is true that he had worked on the foundation of camouflage, i.e. visual illusion. This is an amazing article he published in 1942 on total camouflage, saying that the war is perhaps a war of production, producing more airplanes and more tanks, but it's also a war of magic. And camouflage is about magic. It is about hiding the reality through various strategies. Architectural schools were involved, and I want to mention this here. These are two designs made by students from the École des Beaux-Arts in 1838. You know that there are some teachers here, and they would agree with me that the worst thing in a school is when students are bored. So in order to excite them, you need to propose studio themes that are up to date and that correspond to current issues. So what was more exciting for Beaux-Arts students in 1938 than camouflage? And here the design was about une cité camouflée, and it's true that you don't see a lot on the, it was an easy topic, you don't see a lot, you just needed to make trees and maybe some little chunks of walls. So this is how the Beaux-Arts worked. And many architects were engaged in the camouflage teams of the French army in 1939. This is a very different strategy. Let me drink some water. A very different strategy, one that you find in the US, where almost all schools of architecture developed camouflage program. These are 2 pages of a camouflage handbook made by a German immigrant architect called Konrad Wittmann on the camouflaging of industrial facilities. And you see all that camouflage entailed an understanding of landscape, an understanding of geometry, and in particular of geometry of shadows, and an understanding of texture. And Wittmann published his book and taught in many institutions. He taught at Pratt Institute in New York, essentially, but also, and you see on the left this amusing scheme for hiding a grain silo. On the right, an exercise made for a class he taught at the University of Pennsylvania. The architect who did the drawing on the right is Louis Kahn. Louis Kahn was almost out of work, like many architects of his generation, and he took a course in camouflage in order possibly to find a job with the military. Another city where the study of camouflage developed was Chicago, where Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and other teachers of the Bauhaus had established, had redeveloped their programs. Moholy-Nagy was teaching at the School of Design, also called New Bauhaus, and he worked on, together with a painter who would have after the war a major impact on on programs in visual studies in North America, another Hungarian born artist, George Kepes. They developed camouflage studies. You see them on the left, a page of one of their articles. And what I find interesting here is what the question of camouflage reveals. It is based as much of Bauhaus education on the use of the psychology of form, the Gestalt psychology invented in Germany. But instead of using the psychology of form to deconstruct form and objectivize the process of perception, the system was working backwards to produce illusion. At the point that a Chicago newspaper could print a page with a title, "How Chicago May Hide from Bombers." Complete illusion, of course. Chicago could not be hidden, but possibly parts of Chicago could be made so strange so as to disturb the bombers. Here are pages from the notebook of a student. I found them at the archive of the Illinois Institute of Technology. Pages of a student notebook for one of his courses. So the question of shadows, the question of texture. It's a very interesting moment also in the movement towards a more abstract design culture, since the question is to hide real object and create abstract form that would be distracting. The Russians were also very good and developed projects. Here we are. These are German projects in which my two stories in a way meet: underground and camouflaged. On the left, it's a camouflage handbook of 1935 in Russia, showing a German project for a grandiose German camouflaged hangar under the ground. And on the right, another German project of the time. But the most amazing stories are the ones that developed in the US, in the West Coast in particular, with the camouflaging of entire airplane factories. So the Americans did not build underground factories at that time. They had built very interesting new structures. They just transformed them into suburban subdivisions, into innocent suburbs. This photo is the photo of a Boeing plant in Seattle, transformed into a suburban landscape with roads, little houses, trees, and even cars parked on the street. Everything is illusion. It's completely fake, and in fact, under this little portion of suburban landscape, you have a factory. One of the most extraordinary projects was made in Santa Monica, in Los Angeles, at the Douglas factory. You see two views of the Douglas factory camouflage. It is amazing. We see it from above here, and again, it looks very much like suburban landscape, to the point that an anecdote was reported about a pilot who was unable to find the airfield returning from a long flight and had to land elsewhere. Here we see the system seen from below. So the canvas, the trellis, the grid of the camouflage system. And here we see the manner in which it was covered by little houses. Of course, the proportion was modified. You see all these trees that were created out of various types of materials. Of course, we can't forget here that Santa Monica is only 10 kilometers away from Hollywood. And in fact, the camouflage works were done by groups of stage decorators from Warner, RKO, or Disney, who worked for civilian defense and created fake landscapes, hidden landscapes. In order to give illusion of truth, you had to change the landscape from time to time. So here we see a female work, fake vegetation, linen was put on the cords, cars were moved from time to time, the illusion of a living city was given. And also in other parts of the city, this is here the roof of the Lockheed factory in Burbank. So it's probably, compared to the somber, sinister, and horrible scenes in the German forced labor in underground factory, this is probably the lighter side of the war. But nonetheless, it shows you how the question of vision was central in those years. Many architects worked for camouflage. Here is a drawing by Hugh Casson, very talented British architect who became, after the war, the head designer for the Festival of Britain exhibition of 51, very important architect after the war. And Casson had a very interesting analysis of camouflage in an article he wrote in 1944, saying that in the end, camouflage was not only useful for war purposes, but camouflage led him to break with the idea that modern architecture had to be white, as it was understood in England in the 30s. He discovered the value of color. He discovered also the value of contrast between shapes. In short, camouflage led as much as the ruins of the British bombed city led to the new picturesque characteristic of British post-war architecture. And in looking now, even after having done the book and made the show, although the exhibition might finally come to Europe one day, I'm continuing to find new evidence and interesting materials. Here in a German archive, I found drawings by an architect called Bernhard Pfau. The idea is to camouflage and hide an entire network of canals in the north of France, because canals were used to move around pieces of rockets by the Germans. So hiding the canals, and in order to do that, Faure imagined very lightweight tensile structures, very interesting cable structures on which canvas could be attached, and the system being mobile. In this spirit, we find also systems like this one used by the Russians in Leningrad. It's the camouflaging of the Smolny Institute. Now, a last point about camouflage, and a little conclusive chapter. The last point is the change of scale. What we've seen so far were attempts at camouflaging buildings, even huge buildings like factories, or sometimes camouflaging pieces of infrastructure, of networks. During World War I, the French had made a crazy project, or imagine a crazy project. There is a little book now devoted to it, which strangely was published in parallel to my big black book. This project was called Le Faux Paris, Fake Paris, or Faux Paris. The idea being to hide, at a time in which Zeppelin attacks were proliferating, to hide the real city of Paris, leave it in the black, in the dark, and create a fake city, more or less a form similar to Paris in this loop of the Seine at Conflans-Sainte-Honorine, creating the illusion of squares, of railway stations, and using light to make everything plausible during the nighttime raids of the Zeppelins. It was a sort of marvel as designed, and we only experimented very minimally. It was a sort of masterpiece of electrical engineering designed by an Italian lighting designer who would later become the author of the illumination of the Eiffel Tower in 1925. The most interesting and crazy one is a project made, actually implemented in Hamburg. You see here on the top, but very quickly discovered by VLIs, you see the typical form of Hamburg on top, still today the same, with two lakes, the interior lake and the exterior lake, and between the two, the railway tracks and the very important railway station. Here you see the interior lake covered in canvas and wood in order to resemble a piece of city. This is what you see here. You see on top before, at the bottom after. This is, of course, what the Allies were not supposed to see. And the Allies, these are 2 pages from Wittmann's handbook. You see that Wittmann dismantles and deconstructs the system and shows how fake roads were put on top of the station. This project was, of course, very quickly known and didn't fool anybody. But the role of these projects were not to completely hide buildings. They were only to disturb pilots flying at, amidst shells, amidst artillery shells, trying to keep their plane straight and to hit the target with precision. Generating uncertainty, disarray was enough to, was already a very good goal per se. So now I want to mention a last point relative to World War II and return to the underground. In occupied city, like Paris, Warsaw, and other cities, the underground space became a space of resistance. And I want to mention 2 very well-known experiences that, in a way, represent a particularly intense and extraordinary form of underground architecture, of underground life. The first one is Warsaw and the Warsaw Ghetto. Here you see the walls built by the Nazis in 1940 around the ghetto of Warsaw to circumscribe an area in which Jews were enclosed before being sent to their death in concentration camps. So we see photos from the retaining walls. And here we see photos from the underground spaces in which the Jews hid lived sometimes, hid some of their leaders, hid some of their archives, hid their weapons. Warsaw was a double city in which a particular life developed under the ground, in the ghetto, but also in the other part of Warsaw. And what you see here is a view of a system of tunnel which was created by the Polish resistance to connect rooms that were used for meetings, for the printing of anti-Nazi propaganda, for the storage of weapons. Underground Warsaw is a great episode in the one of the most interesting episodes in the history of the resistance. So this time not using the ground to hide, but also to fight back. And another image here of these tunnels and galleries. There were many of them, and some of them remain undiscovered by the Nazis during the fights, in particular in 1944. And there is a Paris example which is very important here. It's the headquarters of Colonel Roll Tanguy, who was the leader of the resistance in Paris during the 1944 insurrection. He established his headquarters in the catacomb under d'Enfer Rochereau. And as you see from this plan, which is kept at the Museum of Resistance, it was under Place d'Enfer Rochereau. You see that you have a very well-organized mini Maginot Line in Paris. A very organized headquarters. My own father was operated there, was among the troops of Roll Tanguy at that time. And finally, to conclude with the Second World War, the underground space is also present and takes a meaning in the last phase. The war doesn't end, well, the war physically ends in 1945, but the process of memorialization, of commemoration, begins then. And here we have one very well-known example of the idea of using the underground space for commemoration. It is the memorial to the victory of Franco in Spain, designed by the architect Pedro Muguruza, near Madrid, the Valle de los Caídos. And you see here the idea of creating a gigantic underground cathedral, on top of which a gigantic sign is located. This is, of course, a conservative project at the service of a reactionary and even criminal enterprise. There is a progressive project at the service of the commemoration of progressive forces, and it is the memorial of the Fosse Ardeatine in Rome, built after a competition held very soon after the liberation of Italy, and built by a team led by the architect Mario Fiorentino. It's a very moving project, and if you go to Rome, don't miss it at any cost. It's a project commemorating the massacre of 337 hostages, resistance people, Jews, and basic citizens who were at the wrong moment, at the wrong place, shot by the SS in the summer of '44. And the memorial is a double one. It is at once experiential, reproducing the very process of the massacre. And the first part is a visit through the caves where it all happened, and then the end of the Parcos goes through this massive mass grave, under which all the individual graves are located. So here you can talk of a sort of artificial sunken space, in which this theme of the underground is at once experiential and then emotional and oriented towards remembrance and the interiorizing of the experience. Now, the war ends in 1945. Very soon, 1946, the Cold War starts. And of course, we could work at long, but I'm just mentioning these in passing, the culture of shelters and of